Hey, so I'm going to pick up from where I left off from a video I made about a year ago, which is the replicating natural light with flash video, where I replicated soft sunlight in my home studio space. And I think I'm going to continue with this theme, but instead of creating a shoot every single time, I'll just explore in some videos the concept and then present some photos that I've already shot and show how they can relate to each other. And hopefully in doing this, this can help you with some inspiration and even some ideas for your next shoot. All right, so in this video, we're going to take a look at a form of light which gives almost any photo or frame significant attention, and I'm talking about looking into the light. Let me show you what I mean. Perhaps one of the most practical steps we can take when assessing the direction of a light source is to face directly towards the light source itself. So, for example, take a look at these shots and notice what they all have in common. They all, in some degree, have the camera pointing into the sun or into a generally bright area, while the subject and the foreground are somewhat darker, right? Now let's contrast them with these shots with similar content. It's clear that these shots look a little bit more flat, and the camera angles aren't shooting into a bright light source. It's obvious that there is a difference between these shots, and I would argue that one is more visually appealing than the other, right? I would argue that the images and frames that have the light pointing towards or directly into the camera are more visually compelling than their counterparts. Now, that may seem obvious to you, but my question is, do you know why? Or even more so, why is it even important? To me, I think there are at least two main reasons why this type of lighting is attractive. Number one, it helps give structure to whatever the subject is, and then number two, it makes blatant use of our eye's tendency to move toward the light. Now, what I mean by structure is that it gives a three-dimensional context to a two-dimensional photograph. In other words, it allows my brain to think that the subject that I'm looking at is in a three-dimensional plane, even though I am objectively looking at a two-dimensional photograph. That's essentially what creating depth is, right? Or means. I know we hear this term thrown around a lot. So, for example, if you take a look at cinema, take a look at how they light scenes and especially how they light subjects within that scene, you will more often than not find the lighting coming from the short side of the face. The camera will almost always shoot or film from the shadow side towards the light source itself. Now, at the same time, some of the most mesmerizing scenes include an element within the frame which is beyond the subject that is typically very bright, like a window or the sun itself. Now, contrast that with a darker subject and foreground, and we get what typically creates depth in these scenes. So from these examples, you can see how shooting into the light helps create structure to the subjects and even the entire photo itself. The other reason is because it guides the eye. It uses our inevitable tendency for our eyes to move towards brighter spots in a photograph. If you're strategic with where you place the bright areas in your frame, you can guide the eye through the frame more intentionally. And something I found recently is that not only do photographers and cinematographers use this concept a lot, but painters practice this too. Now, I know painting has been around way before photography ever has, or film for that matter, so I'm pretty sure they're more of the originators of this concept. And I'm not claiming to be some art history expert, just, a few hours on Google and you're able to find some things. So in this case, I found that this concept of using light as a compositional element was and is a very common practice with painters. And I found that the pioneer of this method of using intense light in the background and rich shadow in the foreground was a man named Claude Lorraine. He was a very influential landscape painter in the 16th century, and he created these paintings that led the eye very precisely. They would start with a dark background, usually with people or animals doing their thing. Then we get to the horizon and beyond, where it gets lighter and lighter until we reach the brightest part in the frame. Now, this method of lighting the scene is what guides our eyes from the foreground across through the middle ground and into the sky and beyond in the background. This method was then copied and adopted by later painters and incorporated it into their works as well. So even from this perspective, we can see this concept of guiding the eye work its way through history and all the way up to our time and finding ourselves using it in our work as photographers. On a practical level, hopefully to help you understand what makes an image stand out from a lighting perspective, shooting from the shadows into the light source is almost always a surefire way to help your image do just that. On a broader level, on the other hand, really all this points to is you creating more awareness and making yourself more, what's called visually literate. And all that means is being able to know and see more of the kind of images that work and ones that don't, and then being able to act or adjust accordingly. All right, so at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, Brandon, what does this have anything to do with lighting for food and still life? Can these concepts or notions even apply? As a short answer, I would say yes. Not completely, but there are some things that we can learn from these concepts that will help us in lighting for food and still life photography. A very practical example I can show here that adopts what I presented is shooting this bowl of lemons. In one shot, I'm going to photograph the bowl with the light from the window more or less behind or to the side of the camera. And here's what we get. The light is nice and soft, it reveals very little shadow and yields a good amount of color tone in our subject. Pretty simple stuff, right? But now, if I simply move the light source so that the light source is now pointing directly towards the camera, we get a shot that looks like this. This is probably one of the simplest adjustments you can make in your lighting, and yet it can yield arguably the biggest effect or change in its overall look. Shooting into the light source from the shadows, you give yourself the opportunity to create much more mood, more depth, atmosphere, and even creative options with your images. Okay, so in terms of actual food and still life photography, here are some examples from my work that has incorporated this concept to a certain extent. This image here was shot on my iPhone. I used a bare bulb flash as my backlight and just made sure to have sufficient fill on the front side to balance the exposure. Notice how the brightest parts of this frame are towards the upper right because I'm technically shooting from the shadow side of the bowl relative to the light source. Here's another example of shooting into the light. In this specific case, I'm shooting into the diffused reflection of the light emanating from the surface. But nonetheless, it's nearly the brightest part of the frame and my camera is angled in a way that is shooting into that bright source. Now, compare this same subject shot with the light coming directly from the left side and with a simple fill card on the right. A major difference, right? It's like night and day. And as a question to think about, which one do you think looks more visually appealing? I would argue that the right one does. But again, this is all about asking why certain forms of light are more visually appealing than other forms of light. Okay, so here's a photo I shot for my online course. Again, same concept, shooting from the shadow side of the pasta into the light. For this, I just angled a flash towards the camera, just off frame, shooting into a diffuser, and then added a simple fill card camera left. Now, contrast that with this shot, which also doesn't look too bad, right? But it is not shooting from the shadows in this case. It's shooting from the light side into the shadows, which you would think wouldn't look as good, right? But it still kind of does. Because this one shows the texture of the pasta up close and how the light also helps contrast the pasta from the background, it's hard to dismiss the lighting here as inferior to the backlit one. So in this case, it would be a matter of preference or depending on what you're going for. Okay, Brandon, do you mean to tell us all this only to conclude that backlighting is one of the best lighting directions for food photography? Well, yes. But at least now, if anyone ever asks you why, then you'll have a better answer than because someone on a video told me so. See what I did there? Okay, all right. In the very least, like I said, really all this points to is you creating more awareness of what works in lighting and what doesn't, so that in the end, you'll be able to make more artistic and confident decisions when lighting your subjects. All right, well, I hope you found this video helpful or at least somewhat insightful. Don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well and are safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.